what I intend to do is to start with the present, how the Esperanto Association is at this moment in time in Scotland, and do a dive into the past, and then go to the highlights of our movement, and then come back to the present day and what we're up to and what we've been doing. So by way of introduction, I'll talk about what I've personally been doing over these past 30 odd years. I finally, and I say finally because I tried several times, I finally learned Esperanto using the Teach Yourself Esperanto book in 1985. It took me about 2 months of reading every evening, a couple of hours every evening, and I think that's a testimony to the effectiveness of Esperanto. It literally does what it says on the tin. I met my first Esperantist in that same year, which was David Bissett, in Bell College of Technology in Hamilton, when I took up a teaching post there. And I spoke Esperanto for the first time in the same year in the Popinjay Hotel in Rosebank in Clyde Valley. I was quite amazed by how easy it was to do after only reading a book and then being able to speak it. My first overseas contacts with Esperantists was in 1986 in the Spanish Esperanto Congress in Vigo, northern Spain. And that was truly an amazing experience, which, if we've got time, I'll talk about that later. But for those people who are not Esperantists, it's difficult to explain or to describe what it feels like to see the language barriers just disappear. And the second time was in Madrid for the Jubilee year, so it was 1987, 100 years of Esperanto. And that's where I met Bill Auld for the first time. I've been to a number of world congresses when people, Esperantists from all over the world, come together and congress without the use of interpreters. Rotterdam, 1988, right the way through Florence, 2006, back in Rotterdam, 2008, and last year in Lisbon, 2018. Participated in various British congresses and been in most of the Scottish congresses, and I've organised a number myself in Straven, Peebles, in Perth 2 years ago, and a joint congress in Edinburgh. But I have to add at this point that virtually everybody, in fact, I think everybody in the current committee has organised the Congress several times in the past 30 odd years, if not longer. So, and then I also ran the Stud Rondo, which I'll talk about later, from 2005 until 2009, until it became the Sabbat Rondo in 2010. And Ed Robertson has been responsible for organising that. And I took over from Jean Bissett, who had been responsible from up until 2005. And before that, it was Phyllis and Albert Goodyear. So that's a short summary of myself. And moving beyond that, what is Esperanto in Scotland? And I would say it's three things. It's all the Esperanto organisations within Scotland, it's the people who speak Esperanto, and it's the activities that go on in and around Esperanto. But if you translate Esperanto in Skotlando into Esperanto, it becomes Esperanto en Skotlando, which is the name of our twice yearly magazine. And if there's time, I'll talk about that as well. So people often ask, how many people speak Esperanto in the world? And the answer is difficult to give. Official membership figures are certainly an underestimate. And it's often been compared to asking how many people play chess. And that would certainly be far more than those who participate in local clubs or national competitions. And the same applies to Esperanto as a language in Scotland and also worldwide. We currently have 39 members in the Scottish Esperanto Association, but every now and again, people either appear through personal contact or at events who have learned or are learning the language, and then they're never seen again. And then there's also those who, especially with the advent of Duolingo, who learn Esperanto and never show up on the radar. And one example I like to give is recently, in the past few years, a student at Aberdeen University learned Esperanto, became really enthusiastic about it, started a club within the university, and attracted a group of participants which numbered between 6 and 9, and on different occasions, and met regularly for the majority of his time there as a student. But neither he nor any of his group joined the association, nor turned up at any of our events. So that kind of thing happens, and just by chance we found out about it. In fairness to him, I have to say that the association is full of fuddy-duddies like me, and it has been like that for a long time. When I joined the association in the 1980s, at the tender age of 31, I was at that time the youngest member. So that gives you a picture of our age profile. So what I'll talk about, of necessity, my talk will be about the Scottish Association, because I can't really talk about those who are off grid. And I'll also speak, in fact, I'll mainly speak about the Edinburgh and Glasgow societies, although there have been others, numerous societies over the years. So the Scottish Esperanto Association is a charity. It is in consultative relations with the Esperanto Asocio de Britio, and it is in relations with UEA, Universala Esperanto Asocio, which is the umbrella organization for Esperantists throughout the world. And its activities fall into two main categories: our events and our publications. So the events of the association consist of the Congress, the Sabbat Rondo, and the Zamenhof Tago. So the Congress is organized by the president of the association, who holds office for a term of 1 year, although that actually may be changing. The event takes place in a different Scottish town on each occasion, usually the president's hometown or somewhere near where they live. And normally it runs from a Friday evening to a Sunday evening, so it's a weekend Congress. But occasionally there's a post-Congress excursion on the Monday. And because a different organizer has responsibility for the Congress each year, but they tend to follow a standard pattern, which is a welcome on the Friday evening with a talk in Esperanto. The Saturday would usually include an excursion after talks in Esperanto in the morning, and in the evening would be some entertainment, possibly in the form of music or a quiz or something similar, dancing sometimes. And examples from recent events are a trip to the Crannog Centre in Loch Tay, which was really enjoyable, and that was during the Congress in Perth in 2018. And it was followed by a post-Congress trip to Dundee to visit Scott's ship Discovery, which went to the Antarctic. And to show the variety, the Congress of the following year was in Carnwath. It was a much more intimate event, and the excursion then was to the nearby home of the Scottish poet and polemicist Hugh McDermott. We often make an effort to bring a foreign visitor just to take advantage and just to put into practice the experience of speaking Esperanto to somebody who doesn't share our native language. In the past, we've had Stano Marcek from Slovakia, who was the former editor of the World Esperanto Association's magazine, Esperanto, and he came to a congress in Dundee. And incidentally, that congress included a thoroughly enjoyable excursion to Care No More fruit wines in Errol. So I don't need to explain why it was so enjoyable. And at our joint British Scot sorry, I'll say it again, our joint British Scottish Esperanto Congress in Edinburgh, we had Victor Sole, and we also had a linguist, Andrew Weir from Trondheim. That's a bit tongue-in-cheek because Andrew Weir is Scottish, started off as a young lad in our association, and is now a lecturer in linguistics in Trondheim. In the Congress in Perth, we were delighted to host Nina Pietuchowska from Białystok, which is the town in Poland where Zamenhof conceived the idea of Esperanto. And it's told that this was on account of the divisions between the 4 linguistic communities in his hometown. The association's annual general meeting, AGM, takes place in the Congress, and this has led to a unique record in Esperanto history. So if we define a Congress as an event with talks, meetings, and perhaps some entertainment, and an AGM, then the Scottish Esperanto Association boasts the longest uninterrupted series of congresses in the Esperanto world. The first one took place in 1906, so that makes this year's the 115th, and one has occurred every year since 1906. Even during the 2 World Wars, some event took place in Scotland with an AGM, so whether that was just an afternoon of talks, meetings, and entertainment. So that continuous series has gone on uninterrupted. In the midst of this coronavirus crisis, we're obviously keen to continue that unbroken series. So after discussion, what we're going to do is postpone the planned Congress in Inverness until next year, and bring about our first ever virtual Congress at the end of May this year, so at the time when the Inverness Congress should have taken place. So that's the Congress. The next main event of the year is the Sabbath Rondo, which, as I already said, replaced the Stud Rondo, or the study circle. Now, as numbers declined, a weekend event, the Stud Rondos, which is a weekend event more focused on deepening the participants' language skills than a Congress would do, it became inviable. And the last Stud Rondo took place in Churches Houses in Dunblane on the weekend of the 3rd and 4th of October in 2009. But the following year saw the inauguration of the Sabbath Rondo, which means a Saturday circle, and it's quite possible that that incorporated as much study but less entertainment than a full Stud Rondo would. And these have taken place in diverse locations such as Glasgow, Edinburgh, and even in Lockerbie. And then the third event of the year is the Zamenhof Day, and we have that in common with many Esperanto groups throughout the world. Traditionally, it takes place on the 15th of December, which is as a celebration of Zamenhof's birthday, and usually it takes place on the nearest Saturday when people are off work, the nearest Saturday to the 15th. And that usually means a theme talk linking current events or something within Scotland to Zamenhof, and it's followed by socialising and the cutting of a cake for his birthday. So those are the 3 main events. In addition to these, regular Esperanto activity takes place in a number of different places throughout Scotland, and especially and encouragingly in the past year, with groups springing up in Inverness, in Edinburgh, and of course the people linked to the academic work in St Andrews University. And then it doesn't take account of occasions where individual Esperantists meet up socially, anyway, nor the occasions when Esperantists from abroad make contact with Scottish Esperantists while visiting Scotland. So lots of things spontaneously happen throughout the year. So what I'd like to do now is dive into the history. I've mentioned that our membership currently stands at less than 40, and that is really quite small. By contrast, in the early years after Zamenhof first published a language, excitement and enthusiasm was tangible. From the 5th to the 12th of August in 1905 in Boulogne-sur-Mer, 688 participants attended the first World Congress of Esperanto. A year after that, in Scotland, 38 participants attended the first Scottish Esperanto Congress in Stirling. And I believe we have a photograph of that. The society, so the Edinburgh Society, which was founded in 1903, at that time numbered 133 members. So that's one society in one town. And I think we've got, yeah, so that was 1903. The next year, Zamenhof himself sent greetings to the Second Esperanto Congress. And again, we have a picture of that. So this is the text from Zamenhof's postcard that he sent to the Congress. So if it's not that clear, I'll read it out because I do have a copy here. And his handwriting is truly appalling. It really takes a bit of attention to decipher what he's saying. But it says to the Second Esperanto Congress, sorry, I should say it says alla dua Scotta Congresso Esperantista, so the Second Esperantist Congress, which is taking place in Linlithgow on the 1st of June. I send my heartfelt greetings and desires for the highest of success. Long live the Scottish Esperantists, and it's signed by Zamenhof. By 1908, the membership of the Edinburgh Association had risen to 368, and there were 17 courses on Esperanto up and running in the city of Edinburgh, which is really quite astonishing by comparison today. The previous year, the Edinburgh Society had taken lease of a room in the Synod Hall, which it occupied for nearly 60 years and had access to every day. The Glasgow Club currently is allowed 2 hours in Quaker's House in Glasgow once a month. So the comparison is massive. The contrast is huge. In 1912, records show that the Society created a guaranteed fund to allow J.H. Fred to publish his translations of the Song of Solomon, the Book of Ruth, and the Lamentations of Jeremiah into Esperanto. And it's claimed that Zamenhof used revised versions of these for his translation into the Hebrew of the Hebrew Bible into Esperanto. I've actually it's my own copy here, people to see, and I'm just going to read a little bit, just at random. Dume David forcuris kai savidis kai venis al Samuel in Raman kai racontas al vi cion que faris ali Saul. For people who are learning Esperanto, it is model Esperanto. It's beautifully written, it's clear, and it's simple. And it was a tremendous piece of work. The Old Testament is translated by Zamenhof, and the New Testament by, I believe it's the British and Edinburgh Esperanto, the National Bible Society of Scotland, and the Bible Society of Britain and other countries. So yeah, so it's a wonderful piece of translation. So that's some figures. Beyond these dates and numbers, the energy of the movement is revealed better in the accounts of the yearly programs and activities. Every year there were classes for beginners, intermediate learners, and an occasional class for experts. every Wednesday during the summer months, there was a conversation circle which took place. After that, from October to April, a full programme was organised for Wednesday evenings. So that's every Wednesday evening for one society in Edinburgh. In addition to weekly activities, there were also social events such as whisk drives, beetle drives, bring and buy sales, and Christmas parties. And every year there was a Zamenhof evening and also a theatre evening, these were mostly plays written and directed by Bob Mackay. So these were plays in Esperanto. I've only ever heard one of them, but it's really funny, and they were tremendous pieces of writing. So having said that, that's the ordinary activity of the association, but the real muscle becomes apparent in the publication of the Edinburgh Dictionary. And I think Manuela's got a picture there of the pioneers of the Esperanto movement in Edinburgh. And in that picture, the two women on the right of the picture and the two men were the main contributors to this Edinburgh Dictionary, which was a two-way Esperanto-English, English-Esperanto dictionary. The most outstanding achievement, though, was hosting the World Congress of Esperanto in Edinburgh in 1926. And I think we've got a picture of that. Well, sorry, yes, that's the advert for the World Congress. There were 960 participants, and as well as doing that, these same people organized in the Congress, they were playing important roles in preparing that Bible for publication in Esperanto. And that translation was dedicated in St. Giles Cathedral during the 1926 Congress. Now, hosting a World Congress is a major achievement requiring a large dedicated workforce. Nowadays, there's a dedicated team in Rotterdam to support local Congress committees. That wasn't available in 1926, so that's a real testimony to the energy that these people had. So that's an outline of the Edinburgh Esperanto Society and what it did. Before talking about the one in Glasgow, I briefly want to mention what's called the Midlothian experiment. And this was one of a number of attempts throughout Esperanto history, but this one isn't actually listed in the literature, but it was an attempt to prove that learning Esperanto gives children an advantage in learning another foreign language over children who haven't first learned Esperanto. So for 3 months, from April until June in 1954, Esperanto was taught to 10 teachers in primary schools in the towns of Dalkeith and Musselburgh. And they in turn taught Esperanto to a total of 180 children in the final year of primary school. So that's to 11-year-olds. Later in the year, their progress learning French in secondary school was monitored. And it was reported that the results clearly showed that the children who had learned Esperanto made better progress than those who hadn't. Unfortunately, the statisticians of the day claimed that the methodology was flawed because it didn't make enough effort to ensure that the learning abilities of both the groups were equal, and for that reason the results weren't accepted as a basis for any further activity. But what is interesting, and this relates to Guillerme's talk 2 weeks ago, is the following comment in the report about that. Ser almeno multae personae spertis guston de Esperanto kaj la lingvo ricevis bonan propagandon. But at the very minimum, many people had a taste of Esperanto and the language received some good propaganda. So what's interesting is that gives an insight into the mindset of Esperantists at the time, and still many Esperantists today, that evangelizing the language was really important. So to touch on Guillerme's talk, the Midlothian experiment was fronted as a scientific experiment. but behind it was this unexpressed hope of proselytizing. So it's no surprise that in academia, Esperanto has the image that Guillermo described last time. Yet, if you look behind it, if you look at what the Esperantists actually did, parties, socials, plays, and other entertainments in the language, we see something else. So while these activities are not as profound perhaps as the political discussions that Guillermo described last time, these are nevertheless Esperanto being used for purposes other than evangelizing the language. So this is, I think, what you would call prefigurative activities. So I'm not exactly sure if I've got that right, but I think it is. So I now want to talk about the Glasgow Esperanto Society, and to do that, I want to read a part of an article by David Kelso, which touches on the times in which Esperanto was born into. So I've picked this because it's a beautiful summary of the energy of the era. So if you don't mind, I'll just read that out. When the Edinburgh and Glasgow Esperanto societies were founded, Britain was at the height of its imperial power. Victoria was not long dead, and at the start of the year, the new king, Edward VII, was crowned Emperor of India at a Durbar in Delhi, which was unprecedented in its pomp and magnificence. Everywhere there was evidence of progress and improvement. The railway network was at its greatest extent, with branch lines connecting even the smallest of country towns. The internal combustion engine was being improved rapidly. The Wright brothers had made their first flight in 1903, and one could travel comfortably around the globe by steamship. The confidence engendered by prosperity was reflected in the culture and society of the time. The suffragettes were founded in the same year, as was the Workers' Educational Association. In Scotland, Hampden Football Stadium was built with a capacity of 150,000. Until the 1950s, the largest stadium in the world. Charles Rennie Mackintosh completed his last major project in Glasgow, and the architecture of both Glasgow and Edinburgh exuded affluence, assertiveness, and confidence in the future. That was the world that the Edinburgh and Glasgow societies were born into, and they were children of their age. Esperanto belonged with suffragism, socialism, and electricity, a rational, progressive solution to an age-old problem. Why not was the spirit of that age? Engineering and economics could ultimately overcome anything. There seemed no reason why the language problem should not be solved, along with slum housing and illiteracy. So that gives a picture of the times in which Esperanto first came into being. Now, what I want to do now is move over to the Glasgow Society, but rather than run through the dry data on the society, I'd like to take examples from a window into life in that society from an article written by John Francis for Esperanto in Skotlando in 2003. He describes the fun and laughter that he, Bill Auld, and Hugh Martin had, and paints a picture of lively, exciting evenings. He himself left to work in York after demobbing from the Air Force, and he was contacted in York by Reto Rossetti, and after a while the two of them came back to Scotland to work on a translation of an English anthology into Esperanto. And that's a kind of testimony to the dedication these men had to the language and to building a literature in the language. So John says that on returning to the Glasgow Club, he found now, rather than being a learner, he was teaching the language. and to his evident delight, to a group of, and I quote, 10 to 12 attractive young ladies. The classes went well, he says, apart from the number of times, and again I'm quoting, the number of times it was interrupted by certain persons of the male sex who I suspected were more interested in my students than in their trivial errands. And there was one whom John opines couldn't have needed all the chocolate he borrowed, even if he wrote 10 times faster than he spoke. So during the middle and late 50s, according to this insight of John, his visits to the society became more sporadic as he began work on his Grand Œuvre, the La Grande Caldrono, and I'll speak about that later. So finishing about the Glasgow Society, I want to point out that at one time, in addition to the Glasgow Society itself, there were 6 other groups, with the one in Partick being the biggest. And then during the 50s, 3 more were founded, so a total of 10 altogether. Now, what I want to do now is to move on to, unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to talk about it, the halcyon days of the Scottish Esperanto movement. And these started quite abruptly, but not necessarily unexpectedly, with the publication of Kvaropo in 1952. This is a collection of poems by the poets William Auld, John Dinwoodie, John Francis, and Retta Rossetti. Excuse me, I'll just take time to pour some water. The poems in that collection remained Dinwoodie's only original work. Rossetti published other poetry collections, short stories, and essays. John Francis continued to write poetry, but his greatest creations, in my opinion, were his prose pieces, which I'll mention shortly. It doesn't need to be said that Auld was the giant of the 4. So for a picture of Auld, he was a prolific writer, editor, and translator. And he is regarded as the best Esperanto poet of the second half of the 20th century. That's Auld, second from the right in that picture. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize in Literature on 3 occasions, 1999, 2004, and 2006. And his magnum opus, La Infanerasso, being the most, it was clear that the main justification for the nomination, but obviously the huge amount of work he also did. He contributed so much that it's impossible to pick out any one piece as an example, but what I'd like to mention is the last great work that he accomplished, which was a translation of Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings into Esperanto, and here's my copies here. As Marjorie Bolton said at the time, it was just to type out a book of that size would be a huge undertaking, but to translate it too was a momentous achievement. It's certainly outstanding, not just in its size, but also in the quality of the translation and fidelity to the original. So that was Bill Auld. John Francis wasn't as prolific as Auld, yet the quality of his work rivals some of the best writers in other languages. His masterpiece, La Grande Caldrono, is one of the most enjoyable books that I've ever read. And although it's set in a different time and circumstances, and it treats a different social class, I find it reminiscent of Tolstoy's Anna Karenina. I can't say I'm a literary expert, and I'm sure many others would disagree with me, but that's certainly the kind of juicy involvement in human nature that the book gives, that I also found in Anna Karenina. John Francis turned his hand to other genres, so science fiction with Messio Senalveno. So that's it there. I don't know if I'm on screen with this. And it's easily as good as anything that Isaac Asimov produced. He turned to children's writing with La Castello di Vitro. I don't have a copy here to show. And again, that story is able to hold its own against the best children's authors. So the halcyon days of the Esperanto movement in Scotland were rounded off with works of Albert Good here. Coming to Esperanto later in life, at the age of 55, Albert nevertheless produced poetry of simplicity and beauty, nature poetry, and is greatly admired. And that led to him being called L'Aquina Gvaropano, the fifth of the four. So, leading up to the present day, in the year 2000, Chris Gledhill, a linguist at the University of St Andrews, translated Tolkien's The Hobbit into Esperanto. Previously, Bill Auld had translated the poetry. The poems that exist in English in The Hobbit were translated by Bill Auld. In 2007, after Bill Auld's death, Gurvan Mackay translated Line Fanaraso. Gurvan Mackay lives in Ireland, he's Scottish, and he's been a long-time member of our association and comes regularly to our events. So I'm quite happy to include him in the efforts of the association. So he translated the Line Fanaraso into English, and that was then followed by translations into Scots and into Gaelic. And all three versions appeared in print in one book in 2015, and they're now available on Amazon. That's not an advert, I'm just saying. In 2012, the Scottish Esperanto Association published Danzo de Vivo, this one here, by John Francis. And it's a collection of, at that time, unpublished poems of his. That was a difficult time because Francis was at that time suffering from stomach cancer, and we were rushing to get the book published. A number of typing errors, or there may not have been typing errors, there may have been the words that new words that he had chosen to invent. But it was very difficult to contact a man who was at the end of his life and very tired from what he was suffering. So we may not have got what he intended, but nevertheless, it's a tremendously good collection of poetry. Still with John Francis, I personally led a small team to undertake the work of republishing La Grande Caldrono in the original, in Esperanto. It had been out of print for many years, and there had been calls after Francis' death in 2012 to have it republished. Nicola Ruggiero scanned the original and used OCR software to convert it to a digital format, which was a redactable format. And after that, myself, Ed Robertson, Duncan Thompson, David Bissett, and Nicola Ruggiero sifted through the text for scanning errors. And the book was finally published in EPUB and Kindle formats in 2017 by the Scottish Association. One work of John's, which is still a work in progress, is the translation of La Grande Caldrono into English. I completed that myself in draft form around about 2015, so it does now exist in English in translation, but really only the first two chapters and the beginning of the third chapter are polished enough for public viewing. And it has been shelved while I've been juggling my own writing for a while. So in that regard, in 2018, the first half of my own collection of themed short stories, The Day We Became Cyborg, was published in both English and Esperanto, that's there, with the title of La Tago de Kibogijo in Esperanto. The second half of the collection hopefully will appear later this year, again, both in English and in Esperanto. Coming to 2019, in December, the Gruffalo was translated into Esperanto as La Krubolo. So I've got, that's not the book, that's just a bookmark that's got an advert for it. And that was published by the Esperanto Asocio de Bertio, with Duncan Thompson, the vice president of the Scottish Esperanto Association, as one of the team of translators. So, in summary, although our numbers are small, we're still active, and through the popularity of Esperanto learning via Duolingo, there are signs of younger people finding an enthusiasm for the language and bringing their energy and drive even into the proceedings of our committee meetings. So things are looking good. It's been a long decline for a long time, but there are signs of hope. I'm not sure if that's an appropriate place to stop. I can talk about other things during the question time, but thank you for listening.